Good morning, everyone. We are going to finish some of the history chapter. This is like the second day of history, and I'll probably break the video up into two parts because it'll get pretty big. So first I want to bring up some slides that we can look at. And let me get going to the right slide. Sorry. Okay, I'm pretty sure we ended on Ebbinghaus on the second day of class. And we were talking about him because he was one of the first guys to really get inside and start experimenting with the contents of the mind, things that we can't see. Now, there were some physiologists that also did this. I mentioned Weber and Fechner, if you remember Weber's law, Fechner's law from intropsych or sensation and perception. They too were experimenting with our psychological experience, something we can't see, but our perceptions. And so this is bringing, finally, before this we were just talking all about philosophy, but now we have the science coming in, and we have experimentation. So here we have Ebbinghaus as one of his forgetting curves, and you can see with delays of time between the time he learned material and he tested himself, how he loses information. And this was pretty big stuff because before this, again, we were just philosophizing, talking about stuff, but not collecting data. Now we have data being collected. So you can see the time frame here on Ebbinghaus. Now, in the 1800s, there's a lot of physiology going on. So we finally get to psychology. Oh, wait, I had a little test for you. What were the two that came together? Well, I just said them, philosophy and physiology. Those are the two things that came together for psychology. Now think back to this, look in your notes, look in the book. Do you know the difference between a nativist and an empiricist? And in class, I would have you discuss with a neighbor. And as we keep going, here's one of those questions from the chapter 1 notes I had on Blackboard for you to kind of answer. It's a better way of taking notes to answer questions. I'm going to talk about reverse engineering those laws of associationism. So I want you to, during my talk, figure out what do I mean by that? How am I, how did the Wundt, it'll be when we talk about Wundt structuralists, how were they reverse engineering these laws of associationism that we talked about on the first day of history? All right, so now we get into structuralism. Wilhelm Wundt, hopefully you'll remember from intropsych, is the person we credit with beginning the academic field of psychology, and that's because he's at University of Leipzig. The German university system was the most well-developed, very well-funded, so they were doing more than other countries as far as universities go. And they opened a lab called the Psychology Lab. They started giving psychology degrees. They called Wundt, who was in physiology, they said, now you're a professor of psychology, and we're going to, they started a few journals to publish their data. So this is, you get the credit because you're kind of the mover and the shaker, and you're the guy who was in charge of putting it all together and getting it started. So it's not that the ideas were new, it was just now this is an academic discipline at university. It says video clip. If you want to pause right now and go to the course materials on Blackboard, under Chapter 1 Stuff, you'll see a video file called Dangerous Game. And that's a clip from a movie on Jung, but what it shows is a bunch of brass instruments being used. And this is what Wundt's psychology was like. He very much thought everything should be measured. Now, he measured a lot of reaction times. So people had to report experiences they had, like the time between hearing this sounds really strange, the time between hearing a click and perceiving something about that noise. And they would have to hit a button or hear a click, hit a button, and they would time reaction time. Many, many, many trials. And this is a way Wundt was trying to get into the mind what's happening as you do this. And people were reporting things. But he thought if you weren't measuring something with basically a mechanical, measuring device, you weren't doing psychology. Wundt was very big on measuring. Now, what the structuralists were doing, here's something to answer your question, was they thought, okay, so we have these complex ideas. in our mind. We want to try and pay attention and pick apart these complex ideas to figure out what are the pieces. So if you have a perception of a sound, are there pieces of that sound that we can train our attention on to try and figure out what are the simple ideas? What are the little, pieces of data that the mind puts together into these complex ideas? So that's what is the structure of ideas? What's the structure of perception, structure of the mind? So now think back to the laws of associationism. They were thinking, okay, we got all these simple ideas from our sensory perceptions. We see, hear, taste, smell, feel. How does the mind put them together into concepts, into complex ideas? And the structuralist said, okay, I'm going to, play a sound or make a noise. And you're going to have some kind of perception. I want you to report to me the individual parts of that perception. So in a noise, someone might need to report, did they feel any tension? I don't even know what else they reported. It's very strange because it actually morphed into introspection. Now let me just say, okay, pause the video, go watch the Dangerous Mind clip, course materials on Blackboard, chapter 1 stuff, and then look at those instruments. Okay, I'll wait. Okay. Now, let me tell you, when I first saw that clip, I thought, oh, Hollywood, they're just throwing everything they could find that looked old into this scene. But I sent it to a person who has a doctorate in history of psychology, and they reported, oh, that's a this and that, and they could recognize all of the instruments and said, actually, it's not that far off. They have a couple things that may have not yet been invented, but for the time frame of that movie. But they were actually very reasonable, all of the things that they had in there. And that was kind of like what a psychology experiment might look like in Wundt's time. So it's kind of neat to see what that looks like. All right, I got to bring our slides back up. Okay. So Wundt, of course, in Germany, and one of his biggest students was E.B. Titchener, American. Now, again, Germany was the only place to get a psychology degree. So anyone that was interested had to go there, get their degree, and then go back and start their own psychology thing. So E.B. Titchener is well known because he was one of Wundt's first American students. And he went back to Cornell and just had tons of students and wrote tons of papers and became very influential. Now, Titchener wrote a lot, and he wrote a lot about structuralism. And we thought for years what Titchener wrote was what Wundt did, but it turns out they actually have differences in what they believe, but that's for another class. Now, Titchener was very big on using introspection, and this is just a form of self-report, but it's a strange kind of idea, and maybe you remember it. Sorry, I'm all uncomfortable here. From intropsych, that it involved people reporting their sensations. And okay. And this is what got psychology into trouble eventually, because this turned out to be a fairly unreliable, not very useful way of gathering information. People just reporting, again, what they perceived. And this is sort of a weird, simple example, but if you were introspecting in a psychology experiment, you had to be very trained, Titchener said. And if I showed you an apple, you wouldn't say, I see an apple. You would report the little pieces of your experience. So you would say, I see redness and a white shiny area, and I detect it's smooth, it has weight. I would try to pick apart the idea of apple into its little simple perceptions, sensations that I'm getting. Well, that's all well and good, but it didn't really push the field forward much. We weren't getting much from it. And one of the people that really kind of didn't like introspection at all was William James. Now, James was at Harvard. He was a philosopher. Remember, Wundt was a physiologist. James was a philosopher. But Harvard, too, wanted to jump on the bandwagon with this new thing called psychology. And James was very interested in it, in the mind and contents of the mind. And so they said, okay, James, you are going to be our psychology professor, and you will start giving degrees, and we'll give you this thing that says psychology lab, although James There's a question about whether that particular lab space was ever used. It was in the attic of one of the buildings at Harvard. James hated lab work. He thought it was very important, but he just had graduate students do it. He couldn't stand lab work. He's a philosopher. He doesn't want to measure things. He wants to write and think. And so, but James hated this whole introspection idea and didn't think the structuralist approach was good, because he thought, he didn't think consciousness in the mind was a thing that you could describe. He thought it was a process. He came up with that term, stream of consciousness. And he thought it's not an object, it's a process, it's an active dynamic thing. So you can't just break it down into component parts. Now, he is a number of people in the States, America, that came to be known as functionalists. And where the structuralists wanted to know what's the structure of the mind, the functionalists wanted to ask, how does the mind work? How does it function? And they based their ideas on Darwin's writings, because Darwin said, in The Origin of Species, Darwin said one thing about humans at the very end. He says, this new theory of natural selection will shed light on psychology and the origin of man. Now, much later in the 1870s, he wrote a book where it was all out there about mind and how the mind evolved. And he said, animal minds differ from human minds, not in kind, but in degree. Meaning they have similar minds like us, just not as well developed. Now, we don't really think of it that way, but still, this was a really kind of big idea. And just like bones and physical structures evolved, the mind evolved, according to Darwin. So he wrote a whole book documenting all of these behavior that animals do, and emotions that they show, kind of, supporting this idea. So the functionalists were based on that. They said, yeah, the mind has evolved. So we should ask, why did it evolve the way it did? What problems has it solved in our past that, mean we work the way we do now? Now, Darwin was a busy guy. He did a lot of stuff. He had fancy pigeons. That was one of his things. So he wanted to write more about animal intelligence, but he just didn't have time. So he enlisted the help of George Romanes, who wrote a book called Animal Intelligence. And essentially, Romanes asked everybody by mail. There was a lot of letter writing back then. Darwin actually got mail delivered twice a day because he got so much correspondence. And this was the only way, people could communicate, scientists. So Romanes put out this call, send me all the stories you have of intelligent animal behavior. And he got it and he compiled it into this book and basically put it together and concluded, interestingly, that intelligence is the ability to learn. So, hey, you're all intelligent. You're in our learning class. That's pretty cool for us. So functionalist is a different approach. But this is kind of the second school of thought that comes on the scene once psychology has become an official academic discipline. So we've got structuralists and functionalists. And I have to tell you, the interesting thing about Wundt and structuralists, all this history of psychology so far, is very Western. I got the Germans and then the Americans, and, you don't hear much else. And I was curious, well, what about, other countries? And so I had a student who looked into the history of the academic discipline of psychology in China. And she looked at old, Chinese philosophers and all this stuff. But as far as the academic discipline, it turns out there was a guy from China who traveled to Leipzig, got a degree, PhD in psychology from Wundt's lab, went back to China and opened the first academic department in psychology. So they have a very similar history in the academics as we do, which I thought was kind of funny. Okay, back to our slides. So, takes my mouse a while to get going. Okay, so now we're back still in the America here. And the thing about functionalists, they're like, we don't really like that structuralist stuff, and we need to look at mind from evolutionary perspective, natural selection. And so the functionalists started studying animals and animal learning, because if we evolved this mind, well, let's look at animals. They're supposed to have these sort of mini minds, that haven't evolved as much as ours have. And E.L. Thorndike was one of those people. He was a student of James at Harvard. And when he first went there, okay, interesting story, he wanted to study kids. But Harvard, there had just been a scandal in the anthropology department where someone was measuring like children and they had to loosen the clothing to take measurements, and that was frowned upon. So no more studies with children. So Thorndike used chickens. And he actually started out having little baby fuzzy chickens run mazes, which is hilarious because I didn't know chickens ran mazes. I thought that was a rat thing, but apparently chickens do. But rats are easy to handle. I don't know anyone that studies chickens now. So anyway, Thorndike's doing chickens, and he's also sets up his chicken lab in the basement of William James's house, which I always wonder how that conversation went with his wife. Honey, I've got a student who wants to have chickens in the basement. So anyway, Thorndike's running chickens. But then another tragedy for Thorndike, he falls in love with a lady who goes to Radcliffe, which is a sister school for women next to Harvard. But she doesn't return his affection. So Thorndike is so devastated, he cannot live in Cambridge anymore. And he packs up his 2 best trained chickens, those little chicks, and he moves to New York City and he transfers to Columbia. Now, weirdly, all of a sudden he gets to Columbia and now he's studying cats, which kind of makes me wonder what happened to the chickens. Did they not make the trip? Or maybe it was harder to keep chickens in an apartment in New York, so he went with cats. Now, at this point, look at the time here where we're talking. There is another video. I would say pause, go back to the chapter 1 stuff in course materials on Blackboard, and watch Thorndike Puzzle Box video. It's just a cool little, gives you a sense of what it was like. So go ahead and do that. And actually, I'm going to stop the video now so it's not too long and I can upload it more easily. And when you're done watching Cats and Puzzle Boxes and Dangerous Idea, if you hadn't done that yet, Dangerous Mind, go on to the part 2 of this video. And I got to turn it off.